President Trump's legal defense team is now in place, featuring some high-profile names, including Ken Starr. That's raising some eyebrows because of the president's past comments about Ken Starr, the independent counsel who investigated former President Bill Clinton. Well, here's how Donald Trump described him back in 1999.
I think Ken Starr is a lunatic. I really think that Ken Starr is a disaster. I hated the way the president handled it. It was a long and terrible process. I really think that Ken Starr was terrible.
NBC's Hans Nichols is at the White House now.
Yeah.
And Hans, why would President Trump want to add Kenneth Starr? What's the strategy here bringing him into the fold?
The short version is we don't know. What we know is that Ken Starr has advocated on behalf of the president quite a bit on Fox News. We know the president likes vigorous defenders. And we know that the president likes to get what he says is the best of the best. Now, what this means on a practical level is that the Ken Starr's investigation into Bill Clinton will obviously be drawn into this conversation. It's difficult not to make those comparisons. And the president may have to defend or explain his comments in the past, as well as Ken Starr may have to explain some of his comments. Remember, in 1998, he was a staunch advocate, David, for having actual witnesses and the ability to talk to witnesses. He said nothing beats that. So on both sides, they may find themselves at odds with the positions that they're taking today versus their public statements either a couple years ago or, in that case, 21 years ago. David?
Hans, walk us through some of the other notable names here on this legal defense team. They are names familiar to those who listen to talk radio or watch cable television. What do they say about the White House, the president's approach to the Senate trial?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned talk radio because Alan Dershowitz has just given an interview. And Alan Dershowitz is, of course, the former Harvard Law School professor, represented O.J. Simpson as well as Epstein. Very prominent legal defender, legal mind. But he has just given an interview where he's claiming that he's not really representing the president. He's representing the presidency, and that he's giving an argument on the constitutionality of impeaching this president. Now, whether or not that means he can credibly say he's not part of the president's legal defense team, we don't know. What we know is that he has said he will be making a constitutional argument for why you cannot remove this president. So there's some distancing taking place from Dershowitz, and there's some indication from him that he is not going to be part of a core team. But when you think of the legal issues they're dealing with here and just the big personalities, David, Pat Cipollone, the lead counsel, the White House counsel here, he's going to have a difficult job making sure everyone stays in their lane because it appears that everyone wants a piece of this impeachment defense. David?
Hans Nichols, you've got a good perch there, a good vantage to see who's coming in and out of the White House. And over these last few days, we have seen Republican congressmen doing that, ones who were familiar faces during the course of the impeachment inquiry on Capitol Hill. Any word on that, about what involvement someone like, say, Congressman Jim Jordan would have in these proceedings?
So ultimately, they're not on the list we have right now. Now, this is the Trump White House, so anything can change. And we'll find out in a couple minutes that Jim Jordan is actually going to be appearing in the well of the Senate and presenting oral arguments in defense of the president. As of now, that doesn't appear to be the case. And we know that there had been opposition from Mitch McConnell and other senators basically going down to a separations of powers issue, right? You have Article 2 representatives from the executive branch going down to Article 1 to the Congress to make a defense that the Constitution clearly contemplates. There might have been a little confusion had you had, not confusion, but almost mixing of the co-equal branches of government, had you had House members also defending the president. And, you know, people forget this. There's obviously friction between the executive branch and the judicial branch and the legislative branch. There's also a great deal of tension between the Senate and the House, and it's usually in one direction, where the House gets aggravated by the Senate and the Senate just doesn't care. And they almost, sometimes it appears they look down at disdain on House members. So McConnell isn't going to have House members on the floor, at least on the defense side. He will have them there on the prosecution side, the managers that Pelosi has named. David?
The question here, Hans, about the documents that Lev Parnas, an associate of Rudy Giuliani, handed over to the House Intelligence Committee. In those documents were text messages, copies of text messages, WhatsApp messages between him and a guy who was running for Congress in Connecticut that seemed menacing. Seemed like the then ambassador to the Ukraine, Marie Ivanovich, was being threatened. Now I understand the State Department is going to be looking into this. They're going to be conducting an investigation following on the heels, I should say, of the Ukrainian government. Why did they wait so long? Why wait until now?
Well, they might not have known. I mean, the investigation is actually looking into whether or not Marie Ivanovich was surveilled. Mm-hmm. And that seems to have been betrayed or revealed in these documents from Lev Parnas, and then action was taken. So Now, on the broader question of why Ivanovich was dismissed, we heard from George Kent. I mean, we have a pretty good sense of why she was dismissed. She told us why she was dismissed. But the surveillance matter is an entirely different aspect. And when you have the Ukrainians basically saying, we don't know if it's legal to surveil in our country. And then there are a whole other different international conventions, basically these Geneva and Vienna conventions that regulate to what extent the rules governing ambassadors, and surveilling them probably is out of bounds. David?
Hans Nichols at the White House. Hans, thank you very much.
You bet.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.